Well, thank you so much, Glenn, for that very kind introduction. And hey, everybody, it is great to be with you. Now, I want to say up front, somebody urged me to start off my remarks by telling a joke about how Tennessee and Kentucky were playing each other in football this coming weekend. But then I thought, Kentucky plays football? I'm kidding. I can assure you, as a George Blanda fan, I am kidding. I mean, one of the most distinguished Wildcat football players in history left pro football when he was 48, a year older than I am now. So he gives me hope that there is still a chance for me to make it to Arrowhead Stadium after this job is done. But no, as a Kansas native, I do want to congratulate all the Kentucky folks out there on having America's second best basketball school. A fun tip: if you hold your school in front of a mirror, you can always pretend that UK is KU. And yes, I'm still bitter about the fact that the last time that Kansas made the NCAA finals, Anthony Davis and the Wildcats beat us. I actually saw a preseason poll for the upcoming season that had Kentucky, Kansas, and Tennessee all ranked in the top 10. And plus, the Vols, of course, have made the Sweet 16 more recently than Kansas. So my apologies to Tennessee fans for leaving them out of some of this basketball trash talk. But anyway, if this all seems like a long digression, I think it just goes to show the lengths that Kansas Jayhawks fans will go to change the subject from college football. Anyway, Kentucky and Tennessee, of course, don't just do basketball and sports generally well. They also do broadband. And KTA and TNBA members in particular are doing some fantastic work bringing what I call digital opportunity to many rural communities. One KTA member, for instance, the People's Rural Telephone Cooperative Corporation, was profiled in the New Yorker last year for its work to deploy fiber to Jackson and Owsley counties in eastern Kentucky. And as I understand it, these are some of the poorest counties, not just in the state, but in the United States. And now they've got residents teleworking for companies like Apple and Hilton. And I've been fortunate to see some of the creative problem solving in Kentucky and Tennessee myself. Back in 2018, for instance, I visited Scottsville, Kentucky, a town of about 4,000 people in Allen County. Now, Allen County has a hospital, but it doesn't have a single pediatrician. And so the nearest one is about 28 miles away in Bowling Green. For too long, parents and teachers, each of whom I had a chance to speak with personally in Scottsville, didn't have good options when treating a child who became sick in school. But now that has all changed. Because of a high-speed connection between Allen County and Vanderbilt University's Children's Hospital, students in Scottsville can see a top-notch pediatrician with a short walk down to the school nurse's office. Kids are healthier, parents don't have to take time off from work and worry about their kids, teachers can focus on teaching, doctors can extend their expertise, and the whole Scottsville community becomes stronger as a result. And to me, at least, that is the power of broadband. It conquers distances and can extend digital opportunity to every single American. And I've personally seen example after example of this across the country. On my first day as FCC Chairman on January 23rd of 2017, I said that my number one priority would be closing the digital divide and bringing the benefits of the internet age to all Americans, regardless of where they happened to live. And to inform and impel the FCC's work to connect unserved areas, I've made it a point to hit the road as much as possible. And I'm talking about driving some more than 15,000 miles so far in rental cars on trips to 49 states, not to mention the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And I've learned firsthand about rural communities that are using the internet to open new doors of opportunity, and also towns that aren't so fortunate, ones that have been bypassed by the digital revolution. Now, traveling the country to shine a light on America's digital divide has, of course, become impossible for me with the inception of the pandemic back in March. But even then, I would like to think that it also had a silver lining, which is that the pandemic has ended once and for all any debate about how important it is to expand internet access to all Americans. If you don't have broadband, you generally can't work at home. Your kids can't do remote learning. You can't visit remotely and safely with a healthcare provider. There are so many things you can't do in terms of keeping in touch with your loved ones and friends. FaceTiming with parents, for example, who might have to stay at home far away. I could go on, but sure, you get the point. Broadband is really important. Now, at the onset of the pandemic, the FCC decided that our top priority was to make sure that Americans had broadband connectivity when they needed it most, that no American would lose access because of the disruptions caused by the new stay-at-home protocols. And to meet that priority, Among other things, in mid-March, we called on broadband and telephone providers to take what I called the Keep Americans Connected pledge. That pledge had three basic parts. That no consumer would, either a small business or an end user, would be cut off from service because of an inability to pay a bill due to disruptions caused by the pandemic. That any late fees or associated charges would be waived for the duration of the pandemic. And number three, that Wi-Fi hotspots would be opened up to any consumer who might need them. Now, I know that there are a lot of broadband providers in the audience today, and so I want to say just thank you for answering the call. Within days of my issuing that challenge, hundreds of providers serving the vast majority of American consumers stood up, signed on the bottom line, and the number of companies eventually grew to almost 800, and that pledge was extended until the end of June. Now, many of you even went above and beyond what was in the pledge. For example, providing free service to low-income consumers, or increasing speeds at no charge to consumers, working with schools and hospitals on specific solutions that would work for them. And so again, thanks to everyone who stood up and made sure that Americans have stayed connected during what is unquestionably one of the most challenging crises in our modern history. Now, as I mentioned, COVID-19 has increased awareness about the importance of closing the digital divide, and the Keep Americans Connected pledge has been an effective solution to the immediate connectivity challenges that the pandemic has highlighted. But America clearly had connectivity gaps before anyone heard of COVID-19, and those gaps continue to be a challenge in the time ahead. And that is why the FCC has pulled out the stops, and we have pursued and will continue to pursue an aggressive strategy to connect all Americans. Now, here in the US, of course, we rely primarily on the initiative of the private sector. About $80 billion each year in private investment is spent to upgrade and to maintain and improve our wired and wireless networks. And that is why bridging the digital divide requires reducing the cost of broadband build-out, which in turn requires reducing the regulatory burden on that build-out. Now, across the board, the FCC has been working hard to modernize its regulations and to clear out any unnecessary regulatory roadblocks to broadband infrastructure investment. Now, I understand that details of this work might sound deathly boring: cheaper, easier access to utility poles, making it easier for companies to focus their investments on fiber instead of legacy copper, abolishing rules in the 1930s, developed in the 1930s to regulate Ma Bell, which were slapped on internet infrastructure. However arcane the details, the results most certainly are not. Millions more Americans have access to the internet today than they had in 2016. We set a record for fiber deployment in 2018, a record that was only broken in 2019. The number of new cell sites in the United States has skyrocketed, with 46,000 of them deployed last year alone. The average download speeds in the United States for fixed and wireless broadband have increased, with fixed speeds doubling since the end of 2017. The number of Americans enjoying more than two options for standard fixed broadband, terrestrial broadband service has increased by 52%. And a new study came out just this month that showed that compared to 2015, today's average consumer is paying 28% less in real terms for broadband while enjoying faster speeds. That's pretty good bang for the buck, literally, for the American consumer. Now, of course, there are some cases where the business case for broadband deployment will not exist for a private company, regardless of how much red tape we cut. These are typically rural areas with sparser populations and lower incomes. Now, we recognize, of course, that building and maintaining these broadband networks in these areas isn't cheap, and it isn't easy. And so the FCC is doing our part to be an effective partner to make sure that rural customers can get the same service at the same affordable rates as their urban counterparts. Now, of course, as folks in the audience are aware, the FCC manages programs to connect these rural areas through our Universal Service Fund. Universal service support is important because it helps facilitate the essential broadband network improvements that everybody wants and needs, while keeping rates in line with what urban customers would pay. And under my leadership, we've overhauled our Universal Service Program for small rural providers known as rate of return carriers. Using our Alternative Connect America cost model, or ACAM, which rewards efficiency and provides more value for each taxpayer dollar, we provided additional annual funding to connect 469,000 rural homes and businesses to broadband. We also adopted reforms for carriers that declined model-based support and stayed with legacy cost-based support, which provided increased funding and greater stability and predictability in exchange for specific broadband build-out obligations. And our newest and biggest initiative to close the digital divide in our hardest to serve communities is our upcoming Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This fund will provide up to $20.4 billion to support the deployment of high-speed broadband networks in those parts of America that currently lack fixed broadband service that meets the Commission's baseline speed standards. Now, when it came to this fund, the RDOF as it's called, we not only wanted to think big, we also wanted to move fast. The ongoing pandemic, as I mentioned, has reinforced our sense of urgency about this issue and the need to bring broadband to the unserved. So late this month, on October 29th, just a few weeks away, we're going to be kicking off the bidding in the first phase of the auction, targeting up to $16 billion over the next decade to deploy broadband networks in areas that we know are wholly unserved, where as many as 10.2 million Americans live and work. And we'll award this funding through a reverse auction. And that reverse auction will feature some important improvements on the 2018 Connect America Fund auction that we held. First, we're more than doubling the minimum speed that bidders must deploy to 25 megabits per second. Second, to ensure that networks meet consumers' needs now and into the future, we will give greater weight to bids from providers offering faster speeds and lower latency, up to gigabit speeds. And third, once the total amount of all bids remaining in the auction falls below the available budget, we will award support to the bid for the best performing network in each area. Now, just this week, we announced that 386 applicants, 386, are qualified to bid in the Phase 1 auction. This is a 75% increase in the number of bidders that participated in the Connect America Fund auction. Such broad participation will, of course, ensure a competitive auction that benefits real Americans across the country, but it will also promote technological neutrality and encouraging companies with best-in-class service to serve those areas. Now, the Commission is also going big to promote the deployment of next-generation wireless networks in rural America. Later this month, the FCC will vote on my proposal to establish a 5G fund for rural America. This new program would use a multi-round reverse auction to distribute up to $9 billion in 2 phases to bring voice and 5G broadband service to rural areas of this country that would be unlikely to see 5G deployment without subsidies from us. To identify with greater precision those areas of the country where this support is most needed and will be spent more efficiently, we'll determine which areas are eligible for 5G support based on improved mobile broadband coverage data. And that data will be collected and gathered and analyzed through the FCC's Digital Opportunity Data Collection. I certainly hope that those of you who provide wireless broadband or are interested in doing so at least will give our 5G fund a close look. So that's a lot of detail. Just let me close by thanking once again the internet service providers out there in Kentucky and Tennessee and everywhere in the country for all that you do to help connect the American people. You open the door to digital opportunity for people in the internet age. And for that, I'm grateful, not just as a regulator, but as somebody who grew up in rural America in small town Parsons, Kansas, as Glenn mentioned. So thanks again for having me. And I look forward to the day when I can get back to Kentucky and Tennessee, see all of the great work you're doing, and who knows, maybe even take in a Final Four game where ideally all 3 of our teams will be represented. Thanks so much again, and have a great conference.
Chairman Pai, thank you so much for your leadership. We certainly appreciate taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today. And as a rabid University of Kentucky Wildcat fan, I will say that I look forward to a repeat of 2012 as soon as we get the opportunity.
Oh, stabbing me in the heart, my friend. But no, it was a great team you had. You always seemed to come through in the clutch, and that was a great example of it.
Well, and you didn't mention your Super Bowl winning Chiefs. I thought that might be in there too. So congratulations on that as well. But seriously, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be here. And thank you for your continued leadership. We appreciate you.
Happy to do it, and hope to see you again in person one of these days.
Thank you so much. So with that, I wanted to, again, hope everyone is enjoying our first ever KTA-TNBA virtual fall conference. And with that, as we transition from Chairman Pai to another very distinguished guest, and someone who I've come to know over the last few years that I can honestly say I don't think there's a better advocate in the entire country for rural broadband providers than Shirley Bloomfield. She's no stranger to anybody that's probably viewing this webinar today, but I want to thank Shirley for taking time out of her very busy schedule and what she does to join us here today. But as you know, Shirley is the CEO of NTCA, the premier association that represents nearly 850 independent community-based telecom companies that are leading innovation in rural and small town America. Shirley has more than 30 years of experience representing the country's smallest independent telecom operators. And on a personal note, like I said, I don't think that there has been a better advocate in Washington, D.C. for what we do and our mission than what Shirley has done. It's been a joy to work with her over the 5 years that I've been involved with the association. Honestly, Shirley, you're a friend to everybody on here, but thank you so much for what you do. And I'm more than honored to turn over the presentation to you. And again, thank you for your time.
So gracious, Tyler. Thank you so much for the really, really lovely introduction. And it is a treat to be here remotely with all of you. And I agree, we're all getting tired of seeing our little faces on these little tiny screens, but so appreciate the work that you all do on the ground. And Tyler, we certainly couldn't do what we do in Washington without all of you in Kentucky and Tennessee. Tyler, Lavoie, your associations doing the amazing work that you're doing. And I will actually do a confession. So I actually took, this is my first vacation in over a year. We rented a beach house. My family and I all got COVID tests, and my daughters and their dogs all drove out. So I am hoping I have enough bandwidth to actually share a presentation with you very, very quickly here today. So I'm going to give it a try, but I will say in my defense, you know, beach houses being what they are, who knows what we're going to have here today. I wanted to share some thoughts with you, and I thought it was excellent that we had the chairman of the FCC sharing some things with you, because it really tees off a little bit of what we're talking about here today. So, and I'm delighted also that I'm going to be followed by Mike Romano, who I will introduce when I am done, who is my partner in crime, because I know Mike will certainly have some commentary after the chairman's discussion. But just really quickly, you know, obviously we talk about, you know, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What have we learned as a country? And I think the chairman is spot on. You know, when we talk about what we learned throughout this pandemic, we learned how critical your networks are. We learned that the work that you did nonstop was beyond heroic. You helped the country continue to move forward during completely unprecedented times. You know, we had folks going home. You know, this is poignant to me because when have you ever seen the Capitol so empty? But, you know, you had folks working from home, students learning from home. I know that Tyler's kids went back to school today. Good for them. We probably won't see that in the Washington area in a long time still. But what you also saw is your networks, and you saw the network usage of what you all provided just grow not only exponentially, but you saw that your peaks stayed longer. All of you probably have measured your own network usage, but the thing that impressed us the most was how well your networks held up and how key that was. And what a great message for us to share with policymakers through all of the different programs, the universal service reform that the chairman discussed, the USDA programs that are out there. Your networks performed. What a great way to show America, to show policymakers what a wise investment all of that has been. And again, as the chairman noted, you know, the pledge was so significant to us because the vast majority of folks on that pledge were NTCA member companies, and to be able to share with people that you actually walk the talk. You do the business of providing folks the services that they need. The only thing that I would say that I probably disagree, you know, probably would quarrel a little bit with the chairman is there is a digital divide, but I really see it as a rural divide. And those of you, you know, serving your communities know better than anybody how very difficult it is, but yet at the same time, how very, very important it is to actually do that work. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we've been having some really interesting conversations with other folks in the industry these days in the rural space, talking about applications. So we know what happened with COVID. We know the pandemic. We know the pressures. We know the importance. But there's some things, some applications that I think are really key that have also really stood out. And I think we've got some interesting opportunities in the months ahead to really share more of these statistics with policymakers. Smart agriculture, when we talk about being more efficient as a country and we think about increasing productivity and increasing savings, things that are going to be even more important now than ever. You know, and you start looking at how variable rate applications in no-till situations can save $36 to $88 an acre. The fact that you can save almost $13 an acre doing smart ag in cotton production. All of these things that are going to, as the economy kind of tightens a little bit, are going to be extremely important. You know, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we are starting to do a lot more partnering with a lot of rural organizations like Land of Lakes. Those of you who joined us for NTCA's Fall Conference had the opportunity to hear from Beth Ford, talking about some of the things that are so important in terms of what we can do with agriculture. To be really honest with you, it's so nice to have other voices at the table. Again, you know, Walt Tyler was most gracious. The reason NTCA has been able to move things along is not only the great team that we've built, but the fact that you all are you're the folks on the ground, you're the ones telling your story, and that story can be so powerful. Now, if we can get others to tell that story with us, folks like Land of Lakes or the Farm Credit Council or the American Farm Bureau, that makes it even more powerful. One of the things that I think we've also learned a great deal about has been telemedicine. You know, it has been fascinating to me. I've been doing some work with the American Rural Health Association and listening to their statistics when they talk about 130 rural hospitals closing in the last decade, when they talk about 13 hospitals at risk right now, you know, and how critical care centers, your local clinics, how they are under so much duress because, you know what, quite frankly, people are not going in to get some of the basic care that they would normally get taken care of. But then I look at all of you and I see what you are doing in terms of making sure that your local clinics have connectivity. When we talk about, you know, rural health care, it is a little bit more precarious than where I live, for example, in Arlington, Virginia. In rural America alone, there are 50% more vehicle crash related fatalities. There are 22% higher number of injuries that again become fatalities at the end. And staggeringly enough, teen suicide is actually twice as likely in a rural community. All the more reason that we need to make sure that access to care, particularly using your broadband networks, can be such a powerful thing. Shortage of specialists. How do you ensure that you get some of that care? Actually, the thing that I will say I found to me pretty intriguing from the Rural Health Association was they started talking about remote dentistry. And I thought, you know what? I could actually buy into remote dentistry. As long as somebody's, you know, not digging around in my mouth, I'm probably a lot happier. And then the other thing we have seen, and kudos to Ben Lohman for opening their virtual living room in the last couple of weeks. What an exciting initiative to partner with CoBank and the Foundation for Rural Service to actually bring healthcare and accessibility to our American veterans. I think it is the best of all worlds, and I think it truly shows the power of what you can do when you partner. I only share this slide because I will say we've got Secretary Perdue from USDA, we have Commissioner Rosenworcel from the FCC. The one silver lining, there have been a couple of the pandemic, has been the ability to connect with policymakers. I love the fact that you got Chairman Pai to come in and share directly with you, particularly as we are on the eve of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction kicking off. You know, in some ways, because people aren't on an airplane all the time, they do have the ability to kind of zoom in and share some thoughts. So we have been certainly sharing thoughts with folks like the chairman, with Commissioner Rosenworcel, with the Secretary of USDA, kind of talking about what is going on. And the other silver lining, as the chairman mentioned, there's so much more attention on rural broadband for all, making sure all Americans have connectivity. And it also has brought, I think, an increased focus on how do we best use some of our existing programs. Chairman mentioned USF and all of, you know, what is going on there. He also mentioned some wireless initiatives. We also had the CBRS auction taking place, and I know folks have been looking at all of these things. We also talk a lot about mapping. We've had the FCC move on mapping. We've had Congress move on mapping. Now we need to make sure that those initiatives get funded. So once we get through the first stage of RDOF, we can actually have a better sense of what is out there. And we've also seen CARES Act. So when the stimulus efforts first started actually being able to move through Congress up until lately, you know, a lot of the states were given funding, and a lot of those states have chosen to use the funding in terms of broadband support. Biggest challenge there has been they basically said you've got to use the funding between now and the end of the year. That creates a really short timeline, which also raises some additional challenges that we know you're facing when we look at the fact that, you know, you're building with your regular bill plans. A lot of you have gotten Reconnect money. You've got the CARES Act money. And what we're seeing is there is a supply chain issue. We're seeing that folks are having to plan longer in terms of what your timeline looks like, what your access to things like fiber optics or CPE equipment. Something NTCA has been looking at and trying to work with others. We've been having some really important conversations, I think, with some of the fiber producers. But basically, you know, I almost admire their honesty when they've said to us, yep, you know what, if AT&T comes in with a big order, sorry, your guys are going to get bumped to the back of the line. That means I think we need to be more strategic about how we think about planning, how we look forward, how instead of thinking 3 or 4 months forward, how do we think a year forward? But certainly some challenges there. We've also been working on the school front, again, with policymakers, and it's apropos because I have Commissioner Rosenworcel up here, who talks a lot about the homework gap. And those of you whose kids were learning from home for a while know how very challenging it is when we have school children that don't have connectivity. You all were amazing, and you've been amazing, and you reach out and you coordinate with your local school administrators. And we have been reaching out and working with Education Superhighway to make sure that we can figure out ways to close that gap, to make sure that we can connect the dots about where are there kids who have connectivity and where are they not. Now, the thing is, I would be remiss if I didn't say it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And if we've learned one more thing about a pandemic, it is that rough times bring out bad actors. It's just the way it is. It also brings out the good in people, but unfortunately, it also brings out the bad in people. So in a couple of weeks, on the 21st, I believe, I'm going to have a chat with a gentleman by the name of Larry Clinton, who is the head of the Internet Society, or the Cybersecurity Society, who actually focuses for Fortune 500 companies on what the cybersecurity risks are. And he and I have been having some chats, and actually, I'll be honest with you, every time I talk to him, he gets me more nervous about what is going on behind the scenes. But I do know that folks who watch this will tell you that cybersecurity risks are up about 26%. Efforts to hack networks, to get into your networks, whether you're managing them or whether they're your own networks. It's one of the reasons why NTCA started our Cyber Share program. So what this is, we got started under a grant from Department of Homeland Security, and now we've kicked it off formally as a product for NTCA members and for small network providers. It's an opportunity to share on a real-time, online, instantaneous basis. What are the attempts that are going on in small networks? What are the vulnerabilities? How do we look at those? How do we share that information? And how do we protect ourselves? Really encourage you to take a look at it. And we've got our cybersecurity conference that is going to take place in early December. Again, these are things that I know keep me up at night when I think too much about them, but I would be absolutely remiss to not share a little bit about that. And again, just going to the leadership of all of you in your part of the country. You all have been amazing. You've been doing such great things, building your networks. You know, again, having USDA coming out into your communities. One of the things Mike and I do on a regular basis is we have a check and chat with Chad Root, the RUS administrator, to continue to talk about what is going on in the field. What are we seeing? What are some of the obstacles that you are running up against? How can we knock down some of those barriers? I will say that I think both Congress and USDA have been very excited about the Reconnect program. I think there's been some lessons learned. They've been a little slow sometimes to get money out the door. I do think there's a little bit of a communications challenge that we see between the staff in Washington who are actually processing the money, along with the folks who are your GFRs in the field. But I think we're working to make sure that we can bridge some of those things so that we can make sure that we get that money out the door even faster. And I think there's going to be an opportunity for maybe even more funding in the to come, which would be absolutely lovely. Mentioned the virtual living room with Ben Lohman. I would have been remiss to have not shared a picture. We're continuing to look forward to hearing more stories. So let me start to wrap. I know I've been talking really fast, but there's so much to share, and I really want to make sure that Mike has the opportunity to do a little bit of a deeper dive. But one of the things I think is really interesting is we have a moment in time where we have the opportunity to really talk about life in rural America, to talk about, you know, what it means to be a smart rural community, what it means to actually, you know, look for places to live across the country that are less dense. I have a daughter who used to live in New York City for 2 years. I think her apartment was like the size of my beach house's bathroom that she paid thousands of dollars for. Well, suddenly people are starting to reassess some of those lifestyles. They're starting to think about it, and they're starting to think about, you know, maybe there's a better way to do this. The first thing that they will look at, it used to be people used to look at schools, they used to look at some other basic services. The number one thing on the checklist now is broadband capability. Can I work from home? Can my kids learn from home? Can I run my business from home? That is one of the reasons why I think we've got this moment in time on the verge potentially of a rural renaissance, to talk about the smart rural communities that you have created. How do you attract people? How do you get people saying, yeah, you know what? I can probably spend 25% of what I'm spending in an urban area. I get away from high density. I have a great lifestyle. My children have access to a whole wholesome lifestyle. And oh, by the way, you know, I can do whatever I need because of the broadband that you power. So we are really thinking through how we continue to tell your story, how we continue to share what you are doing, and to continue to share that there's a rural America that is served by community-based providers that are doing a job better than anyone. As a matter of fact, and I know Mike's going to talk more about RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that the chairman referenced, but I will say it was really fun yesterday when the FCC came out with the initial list to flip through that list and see so many NTCA members on that list who are looking to continue to serve those parts of our country that are not served. I will also say, you know, one of the things we've been thinking a lot about and that NTCA works a lot on, we work with everybody. We work with all sides of the aisles. We work with all parties. We work with all bodies. We work with all policymakers. You know, and thinking through, you know, what happens with the election, you know, our story is the same. We talk about how the challenges of this prolonged pandemic have caused us all to think about what we value most: connections with family and friends, a reliable job, health and safety, and technologies that make it all possible. So, you know, one of the things we've got to be clear about is, unfortunately, not all Americans have the same experience when it comes to services that are supported by a high-speed internet connection. And I think this pandemic has truly shown a bright spotlight on the need to connect all Americans with the best possible broadband, no matter where they live. It's one of the reasons that we are partnering with the Fiber Broadband Association to actually share the story of fiber and what fiber does and why it is so critical, and how good enough broadband is not good enough anymore, and how we need to aim higher and we need to do better. So I think we're going to have some lessons learned as we go through some upcoming FCC proceedings that I think will certainly complement. Chairman Pai talked about his 5G fast plan. I think that even as the chairman and the FCC talk about 5G and they talk about the 5G plan for rural America, one of the key pieces in there will be fiber. And we need to continue to make sure we keep that top of mind for everybody. So as I kind of conclude, the one thing I also wanted to share with all of you, because I know he was your hometown guy, is the fact that NTCA has started the James L. Bass Legal Scholarship, partnering with our Foundation for Rural Service. And we're really excited about this because this is an opportunity. The foundation runs a scholarship program and it is amazing. And so many of you contribute and it does so many great things. If you ever want to just see some stories, go to the FRS webpage and watch some of the videos of some of these kids who've gotten these scholarships. The one thing I will always say about Mr. Bass is he was so proud of his Vanderbilt law school degree. And when I would come to Nashville and spend some time with all of you, once or twice he and I would wander around the campus. So we wanted to do something that really reflected something about Mr. Bass. So again, we've got this challenge up. You're going to not be shocked to know that the Southeast region so far is winning the race among the regions, but NTCA is committed to matching all of the contributions between now and the end of the year. And we're really excited about getting an endowment up and running. So with that, I just want to conclude that, again, so proud to represent you all, so proud of the great work that you all are doing and doing in your communities. And with that, I am now going to leave enough time to make sure that Mike Romano gets a chance to share some thoughts with you. Just want to share, I know so many of you, probably all of you know Mike Romano, who is our Senior Vice President of Industry Affairs and Business Development. So I know that you know of Mike as the guru who you can call at any point in time and say, tell me what is in line 752 of the FCC's recent order on some obscure docket. But the other thing that Mike does, aside from being a great partner to work with for myself and for our members, is he also spends some time thinking about how can we solve some of the problems for our member companies? What can we do on cybersecurity? What can we do on supply chain issues? How can we partner with other entities to think about scope and scale? So with that, I am more than delighted to now turn the platform over to Mike Romano, who can talk almost as fast as I can to share some really important developments of what is going on in the world today. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Shirley. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and hopefully this will come up. Want to thank everybody for participating, listening to us today. I want to thank the Kentucky and Tennessee associations. As I was sitting here thinking about this, I feel a little bit like where the this whole session's been the Yankees lineup, and you've got Ruth, Gehrig, and Romano today. So thanks so much for giving me a hard act to follow. But I do want to cover quickly. I feel like I'm in a little bit of a sort of color commentary seat. Chairman Pai laid out so many of the initiatives that the FCC's had going on, and now I get to give a little bit of color commentary on those, and in particular how I think they're important for smaller rural providers as we enter the fourth quarter, in the fourth quarter of 2020 and entering 2021. So I'll start by talking about COVID. I mean, COVID hasn't entirely taken over the telecom world, telecom debates, but it sure has touched every issue, of course. It's touched every aspect of our society. We are, as we talk about things this year, we've talked a lot about mapping, unserved customers. You know, one of the big concerns with the COVID crisis has been, how do we reach those customers who are lacking access? And sometimes it's a hard question of, do they have broadband, but they're just not buying it, or do they really not have broadband at all? And so getting the maps better, the COVID crisis has played into that debate. You've got the question of Lifeline. You know, how do you get these customers who do have broadband access but can't afford it? How do you get them online? How do you get them the ability to learn from home, work from home in this environment? E-rate, there's been discussion of what do you do about the E-rate program? Could you leverage the E-rate program, for example, to expand, certainly to distribute hotspots for student access, but could you also do something where you're helping to pay for connections at home? And what are the implications of that? That's been something that's really popped up this year because of COVID as well. And then finally, in the infrastructure world, of course, we've seen whole host of things as people try to figure out not the adoption side, but the infrastructure side. There are communities, consumers, locations out there that are lacking sufficient access to broadband. They might have some kind of connection, but it's not a sufficient connection for purposes of doing a VPN to work or doing two-way video conferencing for school, or certainly having multiple people at home all doing that at the same time. So all of these things have been affected, touched by the COVID debate, and we'll talk about some of these a little bit more here in a second. So what's happened so far? I've got a list of a few things here. The pledge, Chairman Pai mentioned the pledge. That was one of the first things that sort of came out of when COVID hit. Back in March, the FCC realized that a number of customers were going to have problems paying their bills and basically asked providers for a commitment to keep those customers connected. And Chairman Pai, of course, described that very well. We were delighted by the unprecedented show of support from NTCA members and other small rural providers. I think at one point we were approximately half of the people signing on to that pledge, half of the operators. So a great showing by a community-based crowd, of course. One of the things we saw, though, is that you can only do free for so long. You can't keep giving away service and hope to stay in business. Even if your profit motivations are different depending on your corporate structure or other things, you have to be able to realize a return on investment. You have to be able to pay your employees. You have to be able to pay your suppliers. And giving service away, it may be altruistic, but it's something you can't do for a great period of time. And we started to see members' uncollectibles pop up. And so what we wanted to do was talk to Congress about, okay, we're doing the pledge, but how do we backstop that? And this is where the Keeping Critical Connections Act came in. It's a bill that now has widespread bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. It would basically cover the delta between what a customer is able to pay you and what the service actually costs if they're unable to pay due to COVID crisis. It was really targeted at lower income consumers primarily, but there were discussions about how to expand and change the bill. We've been trying to get this bill, because of the widespread support, into some of the COVID relief packages that are being debated. It did not get into the COVID-3 stimulus that I've mentioned here. Instead, in that, we saw, of course, the Paycheck Protection Program and some money for the FCC telehealth and Reconnect round 2 as well. We're still trying to look at ways to get it into a stimulus package that may or may not come, seems increasingly unlikely to come before the election. And if not that, we're looking at other things I mentioned down here a little bit below, grants for COVID impacts. Some of the language we've seen and talked with leadership about in the House and Senate would include grants to help cover the impacts of COVID on companies, on operators, on broadband operators. So that would essentially look a lot like the Keeping Critical Connections Act, but might even be broader in terms of the ability to handle and accommodate impacts associated on operations with the COVID crisis. We've seen other relief measures taken. The FCC, RUS, DHS, and CISA have all taken measures to help operators be responsive to consumers, continue to do business, and keep deploying networks during this period. DHS and CISA have provided letters to make sure that you can access areas that might otherwise be subject to restrictions. RUS has waived a number of deadlines. The FCC has waived deadlines or made extensions of, for example, spectrum authorizations to help providers be as best positioned as possible to respond to consumer needs during this crisis. But again, we're waiting to see what will end up in another stimulus package. Some of the issues I talked about before, expanding E-rate, expanding Lifeline, providing a bigger emergency low-income benefit, those are all on the table. But right now, the prospects of a stimulus package really seem to be held up between focus on Supreme Court nominations and the elections. It seems highly unlikely we're going to see anything before November. Stepping back, I thought it'd be helpful as we think about what comes next and what we're focused on in 2021. What have the past 10 years looked like? What does the last decade look like? How do we get to where we are as a sort of lesson learned of where we need to go? 10 years ago, Shirley came back to NTCA. I showed up a few weeks later, and I like the joke that we sort of inherited the National Broadband Plan, so you can't blame us. It was a terrible document when it came to planning rural broadband policy. It had all sorts of provisions that ignored sort of how rural network economics work. I've got a few data points here from analyses that were run at the time, where the average RLEC cash flow was going to be negative by 2015, and almost 90% were predicted to be cash flow negative by 2020. We didn't end up there, which is a great thing. We went through a transformation order, so-called transformation order in 2011 that was sort of a follow-on to the National Broadband Plan, but actually did not do a lot of things the National Broadband Plan proposed to do. It had its own issues for sure, but fortunately it avoided some of the worst recommendations contained in the National Broadband Plan, substituted some others that we took time to work through. And I will say, Chairman Pai, Commissioner Rosenworcel, who were both new to the commission in the wake of the transformation order, were both key proponents of recalibrating that after the 2011 reforms seemed to work not as nearly as well as anybody on the FCC had hoped they would. We've now come through this where, as of 2018, under Chairman Pai's leadership, and again, a unanimous commission vote, we've seen approximately $700 million a year in increased support for small companies. So what a sea change from 2010 to 2018 in terms of where the industry's been able to go. And then on top of that, you pile in, you've got Reconnect, you've got auction money now coming into the pipeline. There's a lot of opportunity in rural broadband. It's still not an easy business. There's still a host of challenges. There's still things we need to plan for. But people finally get, as Chairman Pai, I think, said, rural broadband matters. The pandemic, if anything, has really highlighted the significance, the essential nature of broadband in Americans' lives, and especially in rural America. So what are we looking at now in terms of the sort of here and now debates on universal service? I've got a few of them up there. We've got build-out obligations starting to kick in, especially for ACAM1. So we're looking at, do people have enough locations to build to, because the model was not necessarily entirely precise on this. So figuring out whether we've got the right amount of locations is something we'll be working through over the next few years. On the sort of CAF, BLS, HLS side, the legacy side, a couple things hanging out there. The prospect of eventually doing a competitive overlap analysis, which the FCC has promised to do for some time. Realistically, that's backed up behind the mapping issues, so I don't foresee that happening anytime in the next few years. The budget control we continue to watch. It's crept up a little bit, but we're hopeful that it will hold at a relatively stable state and actually come down in future years, out years, the next several years, and could get to a point where we even see a surplus in terms of what's available for high cost funding on the legacy side in several years from now. Again, no guarantees of that, but we do continue to monitor that closely. All of you hopefully should have started performance testing, an important issue to make sure you're keeping an eye on. Contributions reform, trying to get policymakers to think through, to look past thinking about taxing the internet claims and think about all these programs they think are so important, they've talked about as being so important to promoting rural broadband. They have to be paid for somehow. So contributions reform being important. And then a bill a day. Sort of saying around our office, it feels like a bill a day is introduced to create a new rural broadband program. It's great, it's getting all the attention. Sometimes it's a little hard to deal with. Sometimes the ideas aren't fully thought through. There's no thought necessarily given to how they interact with existing programs that are so important. So it's something we continue to watch very closely. What do we look like today? I thought it would just be helpful to give a sense of, where do we see our members based upon our broadband survey? We're seeing, and I won't go through all the numbers here in detail, you've got them up there for yourselves, but the upshot is we're seeing great progress. We're seeing steady progress. We're seeing increased fiber to the prem investment, fiber deployment. We're seeing increased speeds. We're seeing more investment. We're seeing more smart rural communities. We're seeing more gig certified providers. All these things that are really good metrics showing that this industry is putting its money where its mouth is and putting the money back into the ground or up on the poles to make a better network for its users. That being said, we've still got a good amount of customers who unfortunately have less than 25 megabits down, and some who even don't have 10 megabits yet. So we've still got a job to do even as we've made this great progress, and we want to keep moving forward on that. So what's next? Part of it depends. I'm going to just flip through the next few slides really quickly to talk through who we're working with, because a lot of it depends on who we're working with. Here's what happens in 2021 if President Trump wins re-election. You see 4 commissioners there. You see a big question mark. There's a Republican commissioner whose nomination is in the pipeline now, belatedly. Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, his renomination was withdrawn, so he will be off the commission as of the end of the year. The big other question mark here, it's not a question mark on the slide, is what does Chairman Pai decide to do? Does he stay around? In the past, a lot of FCC chairs have decided after one term of a presidency they're good to go. But Chairman Pai hasn't indicated, and he certainly, as you can tell, is enthusiastic about the mission of what the agency does. On the other hand, you've got what happens if Vice President Biden were to win election. You see here, you've got Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, Commissioner Starks there. The big question mark becomes who would the Democrats put in, and also a related question mark would be, would Chairman Pai again stay around even if he's just a commissioner at that point rather than the chair? Who would be the chairperson under Vice President Biden? We don't know. There are a lot of folks who've either served on the commission before who could come back in either staff or commissioner role, now looking to be the chair, or it could be one of the 2 sitting Democratic commissioners. But key to this is, let's talk about some of the common threads and distinctions we see between these parties. And I want to talk about a few key pieces that I think it's important to keep in mind as we plan for 2021. Distribution. Both sides, I will say this, both sides of the aisle tend to favor competitive bidding or reverse auctions as their preferred means of distributing universal service funds. While it's great that our companies get the programs they get, the ACAM, the CAF, BLS support, all of that, the trend is on both sides of the aisle to support more programs like the RDOF and the CAF2 auction and less like CAF, BLS, or ACAM. So that's one struggle we have as we talk about doing things in future years. We have to work through that predisposition for competitive bidding. Speeds. I will say that some folks, particularly I think the Democrats, actually favor generally getting higher speeds out there. So they tend to say, if we're going to build a network, let's build a 100 megabit or a gigabit network. Whereas what you've seen thus far is at least some Republicans have tended to say, we want to get more broadband to everybody, so let's start by getting everybody 25.3 or 50 megabits, and then we'll figure out how to get everybody higher after that, but let's take it a step at a time. So a nuance, but an important one, is we're talking about what policies we want to push in coming years. The budget, both sides I think are looking at the budget, trying to figure out what to do in the face of a universal service contribution factor that's at 28%. There's not a lot of wiggle room or headroom to give at this point in terms of contribution factor. We just got significant increase in the last few years in our high cost funding. It's going to be hard to find additional funding out of the Universal Service Fund right now, given where contributions stand. And I'll jump to that on this slide just in the interest of time. Contributions, the struggle we've had is it's a kick the can down the road issue. Everybody wants to kick it down to the next chairperson. Congress doesn't want to touch it. It's a complicated issue. It's actually less complicated than a lot of people make it. There are only a few widgets or dials you can turn to reform the contributions mechanism, but people like to make it more complicated, which then complicates the debate politically. You've also got different folks who protect business users, residential users, who are not contributors today, who don't want to become contributors, who make this a very difficult, thorny, and sticky process. That being said, there are a number of good conversations happening. The NTCA board gave us the ability last year to use some resources to put out a great study that was done by an economic analysis firm that showed that broadband, including broadband in the contribution space, would be helpful in terms of stabilizing funding and would not affect consumer adoption of broadband, which is often one of the claims that's made by taxing the internet, for example. So lots of good things there, I think, underway, but much like distribution reform took time, contributions reform takes time as well. It's going to be a building blocks approach, regardless of which party wins in the election and takes control of Congress or obviously the White House, the FCC. So what does this all mean for RLEX? We're keeping our eyes on a few key deadlines. 2024 for cost-based carriers, legacy carriers, we're going to have rerun build-out obligations. We're going to be potentially talking about what the budget looks like. My hope is that we can rerun the build-out obligations at somewhat higher speeds, reinitialize the budget where it is now, plus the inflationary factor again, and continue on our way. Because I think if we look at it, that should work for most carriers who are on cost-based support. We have to figure out some other pieces and competitive overlap I mentioned earlier, but that seems like a good path and a reasonable one that would then put it on track to expire again, if you will, or be looked at again, not expire, but looked at again when ACAM comes up in 2029. There's a big question about what happens at the end of the ACAM term. For the price caps, when their model terms wrapped up, they went to auction. Can we do something different? We've got to look at opportunities and options for that. We've also got to look at what happens if you're built too well, if you will. If you're all fiber at this point under the ACAM, what happens? What kind of support do you get after that? Because, what kind of build-out obligations do you have looking ahead? So planning ahead, I've thrown up here a few ideas that we're tossing around. We're working very closely with our industry committee. Jonathan West is the chair of our committee and is very energetic in driving that and also patient with me as we work through a whole bunch of things. But we've got 4 different sort of ideas we're looking at here. Do you get more years and more money for higher speeds? That would be the best case. But as I said, finding more money in the universal service mechanisms right now is going to be hard. So do you maybe get more years, but keep getting the same amount of money for additional years in exchange for higher build-out obligations to provide some more stability? Can you get support through 2029, 2034, 2039 even? These are the kinds of things we've got to start thinking about. Provider a last resort plan. Hopefully, if you're built, very well, you can continue to get ongoing support for your networks. And then finally, we've got to think more about how to win in a multiplayer game. As I mentioned, both sides of the aisle love competitive bidding. They love reverse auctions. In coming years, that may change if they find that those mechanisms are not working out as well as they intended. But for right now, we've got to be ready to play in those multiplayer games as well. I'll quickly mention just, and Shirley and Chairman Pai as well mentioned that the RDOF auction is obviously underway. It's a big auction. It's 8 times as much in terms of budget as the last auction. Many more providers participating, but not 8 times. So, it's an interesting dynamic there. The big thing there, I think the Chairman Pai mentioned this, is there are provisions in there that really should help the best networks win if they can stay in long enough in the auction. The provisions for fiber that we were able to get added should hopefully make the RDOF auction something where you get the best networks for that buck. The 5G fund is an idea that's being voted on, I think, in the next month or so. It would set up $9 billion over 10 years to drive 5G into unserved areas, but they're going to try to get the maps done first. Last thing I'll mention very quickly is that Reconnect is obviously going on. A number of you obviously have been Reconnect Award recipients. Congratulations. This has been a great program to be a plug for CapEx in particular in those areas that were really hard to reach. In many ways, this is almost the remote areas fund that the FCC talked about for years. But you can see, I mean, there's $1.7 billion at least that's been, plus more, that's been thrown into this. In many ways, this is the infrastructure plan that I think a lot of people were hoping to see out of Congress. They've just been choosing to do it this way. So this program's worked well. We hope it will continue to work well for our members. We hope that folks will look to take advantage of it where they can to drive broadband deeper and partner this, with high cost funding and other tools to get more broadband out there. So with that, thank you again for the opportunity to participate. Thanks, Jess, for the opportunity to follow legends like Chairman Pai and Shirley Bloomfield, and look forward to continuing to work with you and for you. And with that, I guess I'll turn it back to Tyler.
Thank you, Mike. Again, I cannot thank you enough on behalf of both the Kentucky and Tennessee associations for the work that you do and the work that Shirley does every day for us with the FCC and then on the Hill with our various congressional delegations. You all are fantastic. That was a very informative